Welcome to the Personal Tanya, day 21 with game-changing inspirations from the daily study schedule of the Tanya, the foundational text of Chabad philosophy. And today's topic, we're talking in today's Tanya about purposeful living. You see, the big idea today is that there's a battle of titans within you, and you've got to figure out what is your grade. The battle of titans is between your godly soul, mission-oriented, and your animal soul, which is self-centered. Which one is overwhelming which, and how are you doing? What is your grade? Are you an A plus or are you an F minus? Today we're talking in chapter 10 about the second part of chapter 10 about the different kinds of the tzaddik, which is the highest level, the perfect Jew. There's generally three levels: the perfect Jew, the tzaddik; the struggling Jew, the Beinoni; and the failing Jew, which is the Rasha, spiritually failing. So the tzaddik is the one that is overcoming his animal soul. The godly soul is overcoming and overwhelming the animal soul. There are two, there's just a spectrum. There's a spectrum of what kind of control the godly soul has over the animal soul, much like the spectrum of how good a trainer is with his horse. I imagine that when it comes to the horse races, the horse that wins is the one that is the best trained horse, the one that works most effortlessly, most seamlessly together with its rider. I remember being in the Crusader tunnels in Akko, underground, the subterranean Crusader tunnels in Akko in Israel on the coast, where you see these tunnels built by the Crusaders that are tall enough to carry a horse and its rider. Because the Crusaders were such warriors that were so deeply connected to their horses that they refused to dismount from their horses, even in the underground tunnels. So the tunnels were like 9 or 10 feet tall, and they're still there. This is the degree of connection between the horse and the rider. The question is, what is the connection between you and your animal soul, between your godly soul and your animal soul? There's different levels. So in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. So when your godly soul dominates over your animal soul, you're a tzaddik. It means you're not giving any expression to your animal soul through thought, speech, and action. If you were giving expression, you'd be the failing Jew, you'd be the Rasha. You're the successful Jew, you're the tzaddik who doesn't give expression to his animal soul in thought, speech, or action. But internally, there's a conflict where the animal is still trying to express itself, even if it can't do so on the outside, at least internally. And as the animal soul does so, the question is a degree of quantity. How much has the godly soul overwhelmed the animal soul? You know, when it comes to non-kosher food falling into kosher food, if you have a drop of non-kosher food that falls into a kosher soup, it's overwhelmed if it's 60-1. Other foods need to be overwhelmed 1,000-1. So there's different degrees of being overwhelmed, of overwhelming a non-kosher substance, and such is the description that the Alter Rebbe uses to describe the different the parts of the spectrum of one kind of tzaddik who has overwhelmed his animal soul to the point that it has zero expression, to a different kind of tzaddik that only overwhelms his animal soul on a practical level, but it's not to the point where it's completely disappeared. And there's also an element of quality. You see, we've spoken in chapter 1 how the soul is drawn from the 4 elements, the 4 spiritual elements mirroring the 4 physical elements: fire, air, earth, and water. Our souls also have those 4 elements. So fire represents passion, earth represents laziness, air is frivolity, and water is pleasure. So the question is, which part of your soul have you not managed to dominate yet in the animal soul? Maybe there's just the pleasure part of your animal soul, or maybe just the passion part of your animal soul is still vibrant, and that's the degrees of the spectrum. And that's why there are many, many tzaddikim, righteous people over the ages, but they just weren't perfectly righteous. These were imperfect tzaddikim. What is a perfectly righteous tzaddik? What is a tzaddik gomer? This is what's called Bnei Aliyah. These are people that are able to actually engage with the physical world and transform it entirely into spiritual. Whatever neutral substance they engage with, food, furniture, phones, whatever it is that they engage with, they turn it into spiritual. They take the unholy or the not yet holy, and they turn it into holy through their engagement of the physical world for the purposes of a mitzvah, with a mindful intent, as we've learned in recent chapters of Tanya. So they turn darkness into light, and they turn bitter into sweet. A different interpretation that the Alter Rebbe gives for the perfect tzaddik is someone who does the service of God not to satisfy his own spiritual thirst because it feels good for himself, but rather he does so because that is God's intention. God's intention is to have a home in this world, a spiritual home for God in this physical world, and that's why he does the mitzvah, not because of any ulterior motive. An analogy that Alter Rebbe gives is to a child who is fully devoted to a parent. He will do anything for his parents. And it's interesting because I'm surprised that the Alter Rebbe didn't use a metaphor of a parent doing something for a child. And I think perhaps the reason is because there's an expression I've heard from my grandmother, Holocaust survivor, that one parent can raise 10 children, but 10 children can't properly care for one parent because it doesn't come naturally for a child to care for a parent in that degree of devotion as a parent would naturally care for a child. And I think the metaphor that perhaps Alter Rebbe is using here by using a metaphor of a child who's so devoted to the parent is to validate our struggle and to say it doesn't come easy for us to be able to overcome our animal soul, which is so natural to us, and to be able to reorient to the point that we can do everything with a godly soul, which is purely for the sake of God and without any ulterior motive. In other words, the tzaddik has completely trained his animal, completely trained, like the crusader riding those horses. He's completely tamed this animal, and thus everything he touches in the neutral world turns to light and holiness, and he does so without any ulterior motive. You know, there's a story of a conceited Torah scholar who thought he was such a great tzaddik, and he began to learn Chassidus. And as he learned Tanya, he was wondering if there was space in heaven for someone as a giant, a spiritual giant like himself. And ultimately, in his conceit, he came to the conclusion that God is infinite, so surely God will be able to find a special place in heaven for this guy. Clearly, this guy was a devoted Torah scholar, perhaps, but he had a large vestige of passion, of conceit, of fire, of arrogance raging within him. To contrast that story with the story of the Alter Rebbe, who famously declared, "As ich will nicht ein Gan Eden, ich will nicht ein Elam Haba." He was talking to God. He says, "God, I don't want your heavenly rewards. I don't want your world to come, and I don't want your Garden of Eden. All I want is you alone. Ich will nar nit as dich allein." What the Alter Rebbe wanted was God Almighty himself. This is someone who's devoted to the cause without any ulterior motive. Now, the Alter Rebbe concludes the chapter by saying that both these interpretations are connected. The interpretation which says that the perfectly righteous is the one that transforms the unholy or the not yet holy to holy is what leads to the second interpretation of the perfect tzaddik, the one that fulfills the will of God, no ulterior motive, to bring the God's will into this world, which is to make a home for God in this world. In other words, when we transform the not yet holy into holy, it's then that we're turning this world into a home for God. And this concludes the chapter dealing with the various levels of the tzaddik and the spectrum of the tzaddik. The next chapter tomorrow goes into the analysis of the Rasha, which is the failing Jew, and then we'll go into the in-between level, which is the struggling Jew who's not failing, but is not succeeding either. That's a wrap. You can do this. Let's try to apply.